Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I was a little nervous I wouldn't get here. I'm a local and live a few miles away, and I realized the metro on Sundays doesn't start till 8. I normally don't see 8 a.m. on a Sunday. Uber said it was 3 minutes away, and 20 minutes later, it canceled itself because there's a a marathon going on downtown, and it was stuck near the White House. Who knows what that was for? But here I am, old-fashioned yellow cab down here, so thank you. It's good to be here. My name is Larry Cohen. I'm board chair of the National Social Anxiety Center, NSAC we call it, which is just a few years old. It started in 2014, and it's a network of, at this point, 13 regional clinics, private psychotherapy practices, sometimes a single person, sometimes a large clinic, in 13 different cities around the country, dedicated to providing and also fostering evidence-based services for social anxiety disorder. The workshop today will cover the most important strategies and interventions based on research for the treatment of social anxiety. There's a large set of handouts, no PowerPoint, but a large set of handouts that you have available that I'll be showing some of, not quite all of, during today's presentation. And these are primarily worksheets that I use with clients, as well as instructional handouts that I give to clients, and sometimes are guides for me as well. And you're welcome to download those and to use them in your own practice, to adapt them. You don't have to credit me, just use them. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Randy Weiss, who is a cognitive behavioral therapist in Phoenix. This is our Phoenix Regional Clinic for MSAC, and she will be helping me in demonstrations later today. As I was saying, I'm bringing together different practices from the so-called 3 ways of cognitive behavioral therapy: exposure therapy, cognitive therapies, and third wave mindfulness-based therapies. This is not a purist approach. I've been to a number of workshops in the last few days, and I was getting a little nervous because some people, not all people, are pretty pure in their approaches, and I was thinking, I was developing social anxiety about this, and I was thinking, oh God, I know that some people in third wave therapies are going to be really mad when I introduce how to use cognitive restructuring, even combined with mindfulness. I know you're not supposed to do the two together, but from my experience with working with social anxiety since 1990, I've run 88 social anxiety groups and worked with a great many individuals. There are advantages to using both of those approaches combined with, of course, exposure therapy. So this is an integrative approach, and we'll discuss that. We're also going to discuss a number of debates. They're not really heated debates, but a number of disagreements within the field as to what to emphasize, what to do, what to not do. Do you do it before or after exposures and things like that? And I'll be telling you from my experience how I bring this together. Social anxiety is much more common than I think most people realize. In fact, depending on the year I look up the information, the National Institutes of Mental Health says it is the 3rd most common mental health disorder. Sometimes it's the 4th in the United States. I think it's significantly less common in some other countries, but nonetheless here it is. It is sometimes the 1st, currently the 2nd most common anxiety disorder, currently behind specific phobias combined. It is much more common than OCD and other disorders. It is not always as severe and debilitating as some disorders, but it is a lot more debilitating than people tend to realize. Sometimes people think of social anxiety as just shyness, which could be a mild discomfort and not particularly debilitating. But actually, most people, 2/3 of people with social anxiety disorder, feel that their lives are significantly debilitated by the problem. It may be that they're not able to form new relationships very well, friendships, romantic relationships. They may have difficulty advancing their careers. They may have great difficulty using bathrooms or being sexual, just using stores when other people are around. It can be very debilitating, and even when it is less severe, it can cause a great deal of distress and difficulty for the people experiencing it. Let me go over some of the major triggers for social anxiety disorder. First of all, for some people it is stage fright. Public speaking, social anxiety is perhaps the most common form of social anxiety, although it is not always the one that most people want to work on because people tend to avoid that when they can, and lots of people can get away with avoiding that. But it isn't necessarily public speaking like this. It could be simply speaking up in your staff meeting at work. So that could be very problematic. And of course, for people who are actually stage performers, so-called stage fright is a form of social anxiety disorder. Social anxiety could also obviously be experienced in the context of social situations. It may be meeting new people, getting closer to new people, asking people out, whether socially or romantically. It could be simply being around people, being observed by people, or at least thinking that we're being observed by people. For example, simply walking down a sidewalk where there are lots of people around. Many people who are socially anxious feel very self-conscious, and some will avoid that. Or going to stores or shopping malls or using the metro when it's open could trigger a great deal of social anxiety for people, and a lot of people will avoid that. Also, social anxiety can be experienced in the bathroom. And again, a lot of us sort of poo-poo that because a great many men and a fair number of women experience it as a mild problem, usually in terms of difficulty urinating, so-called shy bladder. The clinical term is periuresis. But for some people, it is actually severely debilitating, leading people to engage in all sorts of safety behaviors, like not drinking water during the day or limiting it, using only so-called safe bathrooms, which usually mean bathrooms where there's nobody around, perhaps never traveling because of their anxiety of having to be out for a long period of time and difficulty using the bathroom. Also, I believe, although this is not how DSM classifies it, but in my opinion, sexual so-called performance anxiety, I hate the word performance, but that's what it's called, is a form of social anxiety because unless it is caused by a medical problem, in which case it would be called performance anxiety, it is based on the fear of being judged, embarrassed, rejected, evaluated, and so forth. So that too is a form of social anxiety. There's a lot of research on social anxiety that I'm just going to mention briefly. These next two sheets summarizes a large meta-analysis done a few years back. And I want to explain a couple things that are rather different. It's my understanding that with most anxiety disorders, there is not much difference in outcome studies for using exposure therapy alone, so-called first wave approaches in CBT, to using cognitive behavioral therapy that includes cognitive work combined with exposure therapy. And as a result, there's a debate as to whether or not the cognitive work is actually mediating improvement or whether exposure therapy actually does cognitive work, even though people may not address it explicitly. Of course, in new versions of exposure therapy, such as those advocated by Michelle Krask, the cognitive work is done explicitly, so there's a movement in that direction. But interestingly, social anxiety disorder is an exception. In social anxiety disorder, exposure therapy alone, or exposure therapy plus skills training, social skills training, is moderately effective. But cognitive behavioral therapy administered individually is more effective. And that isn't true with other anxiety disorders. Similarly, I'm ready for responses, but in any event, similarly, cognitive behavioral therapy with social anxiety disorder is more effective than mindfulness approaches used alone for social anxiety disorder. Mindfulness in the form of attention training, which I'll be talking about a good deal today, is crucial, but when approached in the usual way, which is mindfulness taught as meditation, it tends not to be very effective in social anxiety disorder, and in fact, in the 3 studies cited here, it is less effective than placebo. Placebo was moderately effective, I have to say, but mindfulness alone was less effective slightly than placebo, and much less effective than exposure therapy, and much, much less effective than individual cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, there are some newer studies, certainly using acceptance and commitment therapy, which is basically a combination of mindfulness and exposure therapy with modifications, but those are the 2 key elements in my view. That's pretty effective, but I think the exposure therapy is lifting it up. So, social anxiety disorder, for whatever reason, and I have my ideas which we'll get into, but for whatever reason is different in terms of what's most effective than all the other anxiety disorders, depression and so forth, where a lot of these treatments are more or less equally effective, at least when administered to large groups of people. To an individual, which is, as clinicians, what's most important, a given client may find mindfulness alone to be the most effective thing and may not care at all about cognitive restructuring or even exposure. And some people only want to do exposures and nothing else really seems to make a difference. But as a whole, CBT delivered individually is most effective. Now, I mentioned individual. I'm very fond of, and spend a great deal of time with doing social anxiety groups, which have distinct advantages. They're very fun. Next week, it's Saturday, so the country is open really. Next week, I take my group on a field trip to the National Mall. Once a month, we go to different locations, and we pair up and talk to strangers. And I'll describe some of the kinds of experiments, exposures that we do there. So there are advantages of working in group in terms of people working together, helping people make friends, being able to do a lot of exercises in group that you can't do very much of individually. You can do some, but you're much more limited. You can practice talking to groups of people in a group. You can practice giving presentations. You can practice getting rejected by 6 people in a row or having a whole, which we do later in the group, or you can practice a variety of activities that are much more limited than in individual therapy. But interestingly, at least according to these outcome studies, social anxiety delivered in group is moderately effective. It's as effective as medication. It's as effective as exposure therapy alone, but it's a little less effective than social anxiety delivered individually. My take on that is just that you get much more individual attention. Obviously, in one-on-one therapy, you can address all sorts of issues in depth that in group you can't, but I don't know if that's the reason. But again, this has to do with outcome studies for groupings of people that are individuals, in my experience, who benefited much more from group than they did individual. They started individual, went to group, and they really blossomed in group in a way that they were just moving very slowly individually. And there was a talk delivered by our Chicago clinic, Lauren Neiman and other colleagues at the Depression and Anxiety Specialty Clinic there in Chicago about their social anxiety groups. And if you missed that that will be on our website before long. I want to describe an experience of social anxiety to discuss how the 3 time periods before, during, and after are very important. So let's take Joan, who is very socially anxious about meeting new people, especially in group settings, and especially when she doesn't have the safety behavior of being with a friend or drinking. And Joan has a lot of worry before. With social anxiety, there's often a great deal of worry before and rumination after, as well as anxiety during. She has a lot of worry before about how is this going to go? Will I make a fool of myself? Will my anxiety show? Will I say something stupid? Will I just not know what to say? Will people like me? Will people find me interesting or attractive? Will I be able to get out of conversations I'm tired of or don't like? She has all those different concerns. Often in the past, what Joan would do would be to avoid the situation altogether, maybe explain to the host that she's sick if it's a private event, come up with a family crisis to credit. But this time she talks herself into going. Her anxiety increases as she's there, and she becomes very self-consciously focused. Self-consciousness is not only a feeling, it's also behavior. The behavior is self-monitoring, which is one of the key behaviors in social safety behaviors in social anxiety disorder. She becomes very self-consciously focused, self-monitoring her symptoms. Am I blushing? Am I jittery? Does my nervousness show in my voice? And when she's in conversation, which is actually pretty seldom, she's self-monitoring, self-critiquing her so-called performance. I can't believe I just said that. This sounds so stupid. What's the matter with me? This person must really be bored with me, and so forth. So having a whole stream of running commentary going through her mind. She engages in other kinds of safety behaviors, like what's commonly called pulling teeth. It's just like pulling teeth, talking to some socially anxious people, meaning she says very little in answering a question, probably because of the fear of having attention focused on her, thinking that will increase her chances of making a fool out of herself, making a bad impression in some other way. But she relies on the behavior of saying very little, which of course makes the conversation very awkward and hard for other people to connect with her. She stands off by the side, the so-called wallflower syndrome, although people don't have flowers on their walls anymore, but the idea of standing off by the side and not interacting with people, averting eye contact, gives off the impression that she's not approachable, that she's not friendly. Other people may not even notice her or may think that she doesn't want to be talked to. They may even falsely think that she's kind of arrogant. Really, she's kind of the opposite, but nonetheless gives that impression of at least being unapproachable. And then afterwards, and this is really key, there's a good chance she's going to be depressed afterwards. Social anxiety, socially anxious people have a much higher incidence, depending on the studies, 2 to 3 times more depression, both chronic and major, than non-socially anxious people. And I think it's because there's a great deal of depressive rumination after social anxiety triggers, where she's beating herself for hours, criticizing things that she didn't think were good enough. And sometimes, I said hours, it could be days, weeks, honestly years, not all the time, but people who are socially anxious will often remember things from long in the past and still feel horrible about it as though it had just happened. So those before, during, and after elements are key parts of what maintain and increase social anxiety. In this integrative cognitive behavioral therapy approach, there are 5 key elements. One is mindfulness, but it's not mindfulness in the way you think. It's mindfulness that is externally focused. Some therapists call it attention training, so as not to be confused with meditation. So mindfulness, cognitive restructuring, there's a lot of debate as to whether to do it before or after. I'll explain the pros and cons. Exposures, which I'd rather call experiments, because they're aimed at learning that your hot thoughts are distorted in various ways, learning that your underlying core beliefs are distorted. Core belief work. Social anxiety disorder is sometimes called, it used to largely be called social phobia, and it is a phobia, but it's more than a phobia, because unlike specific phobias, social anxiety disorder almost always, there are exceptions, include negative core beliefs about themselves, negative underlying assumptions about what it takes to be liked and accepted and respected by others, none of which is generally true with specific phobias. And finally, a technique that is very useful in some situations called assertive defense of the self. All of these things, mindfulness, externally focused, cognitive restructuring, core belief work, and assertion are brought together in experiments and exposures. Mindfulness is not meditation. I repeat, mindfulness is not meditation. Meditation is one place to practice mindfulness. It is very useful for some things. I'm not against meditation. But there's not a lot of evidence that it's particularly useful for social anxiety disorder. But mindfulness, there is significant evidence in the form of external attention training, is very important. Remember, one of the most important safety-seeking behaviors that socially anxious people do is self-monitor, which is very different than mindfulness. Mindfulness, as in this client handout, is paying attention to something in the moment, not necessarily your breath. For socially anxious people, it usually means the conversation, the person. Paying attention to something in the moment with an attitude of taking interest, I like to call that curiosity, rather than judgment. And for socially anxious people, that's usually self-judgment, although some socially anxious people, as a safety-seeking behavior, are judgmental of others, but much more commonly self-judging. So socially anxious people, in common parlance, are in their heads a great deal. And so trying to teach mindfulness by focusing in your head on your breath or an image or a mantra or thought diffusion techniques in your head, which are very useful for other people, tend not to be so useful for socially anxious people. So I teach mindfulness as curiosity training. People have homework. In fact, I introduced this generally in the first session. People have homework of at least 5 minutes a day in conversation. Now, this is already very challenging because many socially anxious people do not have 5 minutes of conversation a day. To some extroverts out there, this may be hard to believe, but I gotta tell you, this is the hardest thing that I help people with in the first sessions, is finding ways that they can find 5 minutes of conversation. And initially, we're not even working in situations that they're very anxious about. It's very hard for some people. And while they're in that conversation, focus externally on taking interest in the person and the conversation. Taking interest, which doesn't necessarily mean feeling interested, it may be boring to them, but still taking interest, just wanting to bring it in, combined with what is called, from acceptance and commitment therapy, thought diffusion. Learning how to treat your thoughts as background noise. So I want to introduce the concept of demonstrating curiosity training plus mindful focus plus thought diffusion, which I call curiosity training in conversation. This comes from David Clark, who's a major social anxiety researcher in Britain. There's two CBT David Clark. This is the British one. And his models are the ones that are actually the highest rated in outcome studies. So Randy will be portraying a client in probably the very first session post-assessment. So Randy, you were telling me that when you're talking to someone you don't know well, you spend a lot of time thinking about how am I coming across? Am I making a bad impression? Is my nervousness showing? And also scripted, like what do I say next? You know, making sure it's not a stupid thing, a silly thing, or anything like that, right?
Very much.
Okay, so I want to do an experiment with you and practice that. You don't know me very well yet. I don't know you very well yet. Let's pretend that we're meeting around the National Mall, looking at the cherry blossoms.
Okay.
And I'm taking a picture, you're taking a picture, and I come up and start a conversation with you. You're alone, I'm alone. What I'd like you to do is to spend a lot of time engaging in those mental activities that you told me that you rely on. So really make sure you don't say anything stupid to me. That would be awful. Really make sure that you know what to say next. Figure out what to say next before you say it. And most importantly, monitor how you think you're coming across. Okay?
Yeah.
Hi. I noticed
Hi.
you're a photographer. It's a beautiful day out, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say I'm that much a photographer, but it's so beautiful. Trying to take some pictures.
Yeah. You're from this area?
No, I'm actually from Arizona.
Uh-huh. What brings you here?
I'm here for a meeting, professional meeting.
Okay. And what meeting is that?
It's the meeting of the Anxiety and Depression Association.
Okay. Boy, so everyone there is just walking around being anxious and depressed. That sounds like fun.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so let's stop for a moment. If this were a real session, this would probably go on for at least 5 minutes. Okay, but we'll fast forward. Okay, Randy, that was really good. Now let's try a very different approach. What I'd like you to do is to ignore all that stuff going on in your head as best you can. Just think of it as background noise. There's just stuff going on. Just like there's all these thousands of people around chatting, just think of the noise in your head as like noise out there. It's something you're aware of but not paying attention to. And what I'd like you to do is to just take interest in me and what I'm saying and the conversation we're having. Okay?
I'll try.
Okay. Everything else is background noise, even if it's in your head.
Okay.
So have you been to DC before?
Yeah, many, many years ago, but it's been a long time. How about you?
Well, I'm from Michigan, but I've lived here the last 30 years, so I love
Wow.
it. Yeah, it's a fortunate thing to have the cherry blossoms when the weather is good. That's not always the case, but really days like that. Yeah, but what do you like to do when you're here?
Well, I'm being a tourist because I'm actually here for a conference, but I gave myself one day to do some things, and I really wanted to get out to the Capitol Mall area and see the blossoms. How about you? What's your favorite thing to do?
Well, normally I like going to museums, and there's so many, and they're free, so you can hop in and out, although some of them take reservations because they're so popular. Okay, so let's stop. This is an enjoyable conversation. Randy, tell me, what did the two different conversations feel like for you? Were they different in any way?
Well, the first one is more like what usually happens to me. So I am worrying about how I'm coming across, and it's hard for me to focus on the other person because I'm thinking about what I should say, and so. But the second time with your instruction, I was really making an effort to focus on you, maybe ask you something back, and that was a little easier.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. This is an example of an exercise that we do early on to help people see how different it feels and different it goes. In this case, the differences were subtle because Randy actually isn't particularly socially anxious in this kind of setting at all. But for someone who is, that first conversation would often be like pulling teeth and really hard to get going. But regardless, you're able to feel the difference. Something is much more likely to flow when you're mindfully focused on the person and the conversation. There is another tool that I use called the attention training technique from Adrian Wells, another British CBT person. He's founded something called metacognitive therapy, which focuses more on beliefs about worry, beliefs about rumination, than the content of it, so it's kind of a third way approach. And he has this recording of sounds that, if you'd like, I could send to you because it's now available, that I use called the attention training technique. It's a 10-minute recording. There's two versions. It's a cacophony of many different sounds. A clock ticking, church bells ringing, and cars occasionally going by in the background, birds and insects and water running. I've never heard the water, but people tell me it's there. There's a whole variety of sounds, plus this nice British guy periodically telling you, pay attention to this sound. Now pay attention to that sound. Now pay attention to that sound. Pay attention to sounds on your right. There may be no sounds on your right, but you could still listen for things on your right. Pay attention to sounds on your left, sounds behind you, etc. And it's a kind of meditation, but it's an externally focused meditation, which is key for social anxiety. Training somebody to have more control over what they pay attention to. So typical early homework I give using this handout is to practice both curiosity training, which again is mindful focus on the conversation and the person, with thought diffusion, treating your thoughts as background noise, as well as separately to practice listening to the attention training recording. Some people really like the attention training recording. Some people don't, but the curiosity training component is critical. All of my clients practice that. Sure. Attention Training Technique by Adrian Wells, who's written a number of good books on metacognitive therapy.
I just want to say that my clients really like some of them like the attention training, but they love the mindfulness, the curiosity practice. It gives them a lot of hope very quickly when they learn that skill.
I do teach other ACT techniques of thought diffusion, some of which are described in this handout. But primarily I use that for people with other problems. Of course, socially anxious people often have other problems. So learning how to say to their thoughts, oh, I'm just having that thought, or it's just a thought and it will pass. Or doing a type of meditation called detached mindfulness, where you're paying attention to your stream of thoughts as they go by, as though it were a video, as if you're watching a movie and they're just going by. Or floating up into the clouds, things like that. But again, I mainly use that with people who aren't socially anxious. I'm a little anxious about using a lot of meditation with people who are socially anxious because they spend too much time in their heads, even though mindfulness meditation is quite different than socially anxious people being in their heads. I still want to get them out of their heads and into the moment. Okay, now I want to talk about the use of cognitive restructuring. So there's a couple basic handouts. You've seen any number of things like this, where I do some psychoeducational work about the cycle of social anxiety, the cycle, the way thoughts and feelings and behaviors in reaction to a situation influence each other, create vicious cycles. The example I gave of Joan at a party, I explained to clients so they can see how they unintentionally get themselves into a vicious cycle that increases their anxiety and later often depression. And so this is a way of just introducing the model to people. And then comes the big hot question of cognitive restructuring. Again, the evidence is that cognitive work combined with exposures is more effective for social anxiety disorder than exposures alone. There's also a debate as to, do you do the cognitive work, cognitive restructuring? This is my version of a thought record. I'd rather not call it a thought record because the skill is cognitive restructuring. And I teach that cognitive restructuring can be done in a variety of ways. A worksheet is just one way, although it's usually the way I teach them first because it's so structured. So there's debate as to whether to use it before an exposure, an experiment I prefer to call it because it's a learning experience, or to use some version of cognitive restructuring afterwards. There is evidence that people learn better when their anxiety is activated, and so if they're really good at cognitive restructuring and they do that before an exposure, they're going to feel calmer, the theory goes, and they won't learn as much as if they went into the situation. But that's if you get them to go into the situation. They learn nothing if they avoid. And so I think a judicious use of cognitive restructuring early on can decrease avoidance, and then I pair it off, I fade it out to do cognitive restructuring in a different format afterwards, where the learning happens by looking back at what you experienced during the experiment. And I just want to show you that in this cognitive restructuring worksheet, which I think is really important if you're going to do cognitive restructuring for anxiety disorders, and certainly for social anxiety, where I really do believe it's important, that you include behaviors. So notice there's a section for safety-seeking behaviors, which I prefer to call safety-seeking rather than safety, because to make it clear to people it actually doesn't provide safety, it's just what they're aiming for. And notice at the bottom, besides what I call the constructive attitude, often called something like the rational response, besides that, it includes positive motivators. And this is where cognitive restructuring gets a little active, where people might be saying things like, this will help me feel more confident. It's the kind of thing Reed Wilson might talk about. I want it. I want to be able to experience this struggle so that I can feel more confident and live the kind of social or career life that I'm aiming for. And so positive motivators might be statements like that, where you're not dealing with content necessarily, but they're aimed at helping you do something that is otherwise scary. Yeah?
Can you say one more time what you think is best about the timing that you're going to see cognitive?
Okay. The way I do it, partly because I learned this model through Richard Heimberg, who very clearly teaches cognitive restructuring before experiments, is to teach people to do that first. And then there is a post-experiment worksheet, which we'll be discussing later, that they do afterwards to analyze what they've learned. However, a later group model for social anxiety by Stephen Hoffman in Massachusetts doesn't do cognitive restructuring first, and neither does the individual social anxiety model by David Clark in Britain. But again, they get people to do exposures right away because learning is more effective when anxiety is triggered. A lot of research shows. And then they do cognitive restructuring afterwards. So I want to show that. Here's an example of a cognitive restructuring worksheet about a social anxiety trigger filled out. Your standard list of cognitive distortions. These are things you're all familiar with, so I'm not going to go over them with you, but they're useful for clients in learning the process. a number of tips that I'll go over with people, not all at once because it would be overwhelming, but things I've learned over the years of how to make the cognitive restructuring process more effective. And then after an experiment, they would use a post-experiment worksheet identifying ways they helped themselves, ways they hurt themselves, evidence that they gathered from the experiment that supports their hot thoughts or refutes them, positive and negative evidence, versus their constructive attitude. So in this case, I explained it's like the scientific method where you're testing a hypothesis against a null hypothesis, except in our case, the hypothesis is your hot thought. I'm going to say something stupid, people won't like me, I'll make a fool out of myself. The constructive attitude might be if I focus mindfully and diffuse from my thoughts, most conversations will go reasonably well, would be an example of a constructive attitude. And typically through doing experiments and cognitive restructuring before and after, people are able to see how their experiments are helping them gain evidence against their hot thoughts. Later they'll be using this with underlying core beliefs, which I'll explain as well. Then I fade it out, and this is not hard to do because at some point clients start getting really tired of filling out the worksheets, which I take as a sign that they don't need to do it so much. If they're tired of doing the worksheets and avoiding doing experiments, it's a different problem. But if they're tired of doing the worksheets and doing the experiments, I used to push, but now I realize good for them. And so we're doing a different model, which I call the short version, just because it's trying to get people to do this, which is based on what David Clark and Stephen Hoffman do, where cognitive restructuring happens before. And in this worksheet, there actually are 3 columns to fill out before, but you're not actually challenging your thoughts. You're just identifying the predictions, which are your hot thoughts. I'm going to make a fool of myself, I won't know what to say. People will react negatively to me. And of course, this could happen in public speaking or assertion. Social anxiety about asserting yourselves is very common. I forgot to mention that earlier. But they're going into the experiment, the exposure, without having done actually cognitive restructuring. They're identifying behavioral goals and the hot thoughts that they want to test, but they're not challenging those hot thoughts using cognitive restructuring yet. And the goals will always include mindful focus on the conversation and the person or the meeting or whatever is going on around them, plus treating your thoughts like background noise. After the experiment, they do the last 2 columns, so this is much shorter for people. And that's where the cognitive restructuring happens, but it's in the form of analyzing the results of an experiment. You know, what was the outcome? What actually happened? I.e., what was the evidence? And what can I learn from this? And this can be done initially at the hot thought level, the automatic thought level, and also later I'll get into at the core belief level, the underlying assumptions and beliefs they have about themselves and how people perceive them. So again, I start with cognitive restructuring beforehand just to, well actually a lot of my clients are also depressed, so it helps them with that. But also to make it more likely that they do experiments and then fade it out based on when they start getting tired, which is usually after several weeks of doing cognitive restructuring, and I start using this method which is where the learning, the cognitive restructuring happens afterwards. Now there is a technique. Cognitive restructuring is not necessarily on paper. There's all sorts of lively techniques of doing cognitive restructuring, and Randy and I will do one where we can act out cognitive restructuring. And again, for ACT purists here, just hold your seats. You're going to hate this, but it's. But I got to tell you, my clients love it. Okay, and I can't really do this much in group because it takes a lot of time, but I do this a lot individually. So Randy, we're going to have an interesting experiment here. You've told me what some of your hot thoughts are about this experiment you would like to do, going to a meetup where you don't know people and you're wanting to meet people, ultimately to make friends, maybe even drink. But you have a lot of scary things going on in your mind. And we did a worksheet about it earlier, and you said you found that helpful, but of course it's still really scary. So we're going to do this odd sort of role play that you might find helpful, you might find even fun, and it might be empowering, but we'll see.
Okay.
I am going to pretend that I am your hot thoughts. I'm not a person, and please understand for the next few minutes, I'm not a therapist. I am that ugly stuff going on in your head when you're really worrying about an upcoming social anxiety thing you want to do, in this case going to a meetup. You are going to be yourself, but you're going to act as if you just don't want to listen to me anymore, that I'm not helpful, that I'm hindering you, and that although you can't turn me off, we've talked earlier that you can't just turn off thoughts, you can't treat them like background noise. But it's a lot easier to treat them like noise if you don't believe me. So I want you to let me know how much you don't believe me and don't need me anymore. Okay?
Okay, I'll try.
It won't hurt my feelings because I'm not being mean here. I'm not being mean here, but I am being a little mean. Okay?
Okay.
Oh my God, Randy, don't listen to that crazy therapist. You don't want to be going to the meetup. You're going to make a fool out of yourself like you always do.
That's what you've told me for years, but if I don't go, I'm never going to overcome this problem. So, never mind.
How are you going to go overcome the problem if you go and have another humiliating experience? People are going to see that you're anxious. People are going to see that you're socially inept and awkward.
That's what you always tell me, and I don't go. So how can I ever, find out that it's not so bad, or maybe it won't happen? Never mind. I'm not listening to you.
I'm just trying to help you. I'm here to guide you, to help you.
I hear you, you're there, but I already gave it the office. Never mind.
So notice this was a blend of dealing with content, second wave cognitive behavioral therapy, and changing your relationship with the hot thoughts, like, I don't need you anymore, which is third wave cognitive therapy. I think they go together well. It is easier to diffuse from our negative thoughts if, at least on some level, we don't believe them. If we really believe them, then it's going to be much harder to diffuse from them. That's why social anxiety is very different in many ways, but in this way than, say, OCD, where typically, at least when calm, the person with OCD realizes, I know if I've checked the door twice, it's not going to be unlocked. But in the moment when I'm anxious, I don't think my anxiety will ever go away unless I check it 30 more times or whatever. A socially anxious person doesn't know any of that. They say, this guy might really think I'm terrible, and they probably have been teased or bullied or had some humiliating experiences growing up that have taught them this. These are not irrational thoughts. And so doing a little cognitive restructuring can go a long way, not in shutting up the hot thoughts. It doesn't turn them off. Third wave therapies are right about that, but in weakening them to then make it easier to diffuse from them. So again, cognitive restructuring is essential. It is probably best practiced after an experiment by analyzing the results of an experiment and exposure, but doing it before particularly tough experiments, especially early on, but even later. Sometimes people will return to using a cognitive restructuring worksheet later when they're approaching an experiment they're really scared about, and they just don't want to go in with 90% suds. Maybe they'd learn more at 90% suds than 60% suds, but they're going to learn at 60%. I'd rather get them there. So that's my use of cognitive restructuring. Now, let's talk about experiments. I have clients start doing social anxiety exposures, and I, again, prefer to call it experiments because it connotes it being a learning experience, but it is the same thing. I have them start doing experiments literally at the first session. That earlier role play we did is an in-session exposure. They would feel very anxious about doing that. And curiosity training to some degree is also an exposure because they're talking to people for 5 minutes, although at first I'm encouraging them to find situations they aren't very anxious at, but they're not likely to find situations they have no anxiety about if their social anxiety is severe. I have them start doing exposures right away, even before I teach them cognitive restructuring, although I teach them cognitive restructuring usually by the second session. This is a handout in which there are all sorts of ideas for exposures, but most importantly, people are doing exposures based on their own goals and their own hot thoughts. And there's various other handouts I just want to show you here that I take from different books that have all sorts of ideas for exposures. You can look at them when you download the handouts. This comes from a book by Jennifer Shannon for social anxiety for teens. But honestly, at least these 2 pages are very good examples of exposures that adults can do as well. It's important to pick exposures based on a client's goals, not just their hot thoughts. I think, I differ a little bit from Hoffman and Clark and Krask. It just feels like I shouldn't say that, but I do, who emphasize exposures based on hot thoughts. This is what they hear, let's find something and do it. I agree with all that, but I think it's really important also to figure out what their goals are. If they want to make friends, if that's their main goal, then most of their exposures working with me will be something related to meeting people and befriending people. If they want to date or do public speaking or whatever they want to do, it's really important to pick exposures that relate to a client's goals. These other CBT leaders talk about randomly choosing exposures, not necessarily from a fear hierarchy, but just to keep targeting their hot thoughts in a variety of settings. I certainly agree that that's useful, but we shouldn't lose sight of why the client came to see you, which might be in part, I want to make some friends. So standing on a street corner singing will help them overcome their fear of embarrassment, but they don't make a friend that way. They also need to go to a meetup and talk to people and get phone numbers or learn how to deal with it when they don't get a number or they find out later it's a fake number or something like that. So it's important to pick exposures according to the client's goals as well as what their hot thoughts are that you want to challenge. When doing exposures, it's also important, and here's a handout that gives suggestions of how to prepare for them and so forth that I go over with the clients bit by bit, not all at once. In doing exposures, one of the most important things, like with any CBT model for any anxiety disorder, is to greatly limit safety-seeking behaviors. With social anxiety, some of the safety-seeking behaviors are obvious, such as avoidance, or when they're at an activity, averting eye contact, not initiating conversation, doing it's like pulling teeth, crutch. I call safety-seeking behaviors crutches. And as I said, other safety-seeking behaviors are less obvious, such as self-monitoring, self-critiquing, and scripting, thinking about what do I say next. And of course, there's debate in the field, not just in social anxiety treatment, but in doing exposures generally. Does the client need to drop all exposures? And my understanding, based on a workshop I presented yesterday, my understanding is that the trend is limiting safety-seeking behaviors, but allowing for the judicious use of a very minimal number, primarily in order to overcome the worst of all safety-seeking behaviors, outright avoidance. They don't learn nothing. if they're not doing the experiment. So, if it's easier for them to go to a meetup with a friend than it is to go alone, and lots of people do that without social anxiety disorder, obviously, although that's a safety-seeking behavior, at first, sure, but the key is you still have the goal of saying hello to 3 people or whatever they chose as their goal, and not clinging to their poor friend as their life raft. It's the thing that's keeping them afloat. And as I said before, mindful focus with thought diffusion are behavioral goals among other behavioral goals that they choose. Those are always among the behavioral goals in order to override the self-monitoring, scripting, self-evaluation, safety-seeking behaviors that, to varying degrees, are pretty universal with social anxiety. There's another debate in the field about what types of exposures to use. So, in going from Richard Heimberg's model to Stefan Hoffman's model for group therapy, as well as David Clark's model for individual therapy for social anxiety, there is a shift away from straightforward experiments, ordinary social interaction or speaking in front of groups, but in a straightforward way, versus what I call paradoxical experiments. Hoffman calls them social mishap experiments. David Burns calls them shame-attacking experiments. I'm not sure David Clark uses the term, but experiments in which you are deliberately trying to make a fear come true. So if you're afraid of embarrassing yourself, do something that you think would bring embarrassment. If you're afraid of saying something stupid, deliberately say something stupid. Get a person's name wrong. Stand by the bottom of the base of the Washington Monument and ask a series of tourists as they go by, "Excuse me, can you tell me where the Washington Monument is?" Or in a grocery store, "Could you tell me where the milk is?" when they're right next to the milk. So asking a stupid question on purpose. If they're afraid of appearing anxious, appear anxious on purpose. It might be, I have a history of social anxiety about blushing, and long before I realized it was adorable, the problem is people around me didn't seem to know that and would let me know their opinions about it. Sometimes our fears really do come true, and certainly more so in adolescence, but even in adulthood, it surprises me how often people comment on the coloration of my skin as though that's an interesting topic, but nonetheless. So you can do experiments in which you deliberately blush. It could be taking niacin, a vitamin D that causes blushing. Some of them say non-blushing formulas, so you'll get those, but or running in place before an experiment so that they get winded, which usually creates blushing, or pinching their cheeks. Sometimes people even put on rouge to create artificial blushing, things like that. Or sweating. You could make yourself sweat either naturally by exerting yourself if it's warm enough, by wearing too warm clothing in a warm day, or actually put water on your face with a spray bottle or something like that. So there are ways of doing paradoxical or social mishap experiments. And there's some debate as to which of these are more effective. And a lot of times, people like Hoffman report that although he starts with straightforward experiments, as quickly as possible you want to get into paradoxical ones because he sees these as more effective. I certainly agree you want to bring in paradoxical experiments as soon as possible. I don't necessarily see them as more effective. They sometimes are, but a lot of times what happens afterwards, at least with my clients, I don't know why they never report this in their literature, but maybe I'm not doing it right, that's my social anxious half up, but maybe it's true, I don't know. But a lot of times my clients come back and say to me, well, I could do it there because I did it on purpose. Now, I still think that's learning experience. If I embarrass myself on purpose, it's not really embarrassing. I see nothing terrible happens. But then it's still more challenging for them to embarrass themselves accidentally and see that that's okay to ask a stupid question by mistake rather than on purpose, to have somebody comment on their anxiety when they didn't intend to appear anxious tends to be harder. So honestly, I think it's important to do both. My experience is that it's very hard to get clients to do these, so that means you need to do them first. Which I used to have a good deal of social anxiety about, and occasionally I still do, but honestly, I've been getting into this as being kind of fun. So I went with a client. So the hardest one for me was a client of mine who's an evangelical Christian wanted to practice dealing with rejection. And so her experiment was to try to spread the word to people sitting around DuPont Circle, about a mile south of here, which is a very liberal neighborhood, pretty gay neighborhood, a circle park. And I was there accompanying her, providing support and therapy, but not during the experiment. I was just there. And she went around and talked to 25 people was her goal. They were brief conversations because all but one person turned her down, so she had 24 rejections. It was remarkably brave, and I'll tell you in the beginning, it was really upsetting to her, and I was thinking, oh God, this is cruel. I mean, I did prepare her. I told her you're going to get a lot of practice with rejection, but that's what she wanted. And the first couple of times were really upsetting. But then by the end, it was fine for her. And it wasn't that she found it as fun, because she was also serious about what she was doing, and she was frustrated that she didn't win any converts, but she did overcome her anxiety, and she even took me into situations that were kind of scary to me. There was this group of heavily tattooed bikers, and I'm thinking, let's not go there. but she did. And so, you know, every one of them rejected. One of them even rolled up his sleeve and pointed to a tattoo and said, see this, honey, that's Satan, or whatever. But nonetheless, she was able to accept all sorts of rejection. Because I've lived in that neighborhood for many years, I have a lot of social anxiety about, am I going to run into a friend who's wondering, why am I doing this? I'm also Jewish. Why am I doing this? But nonetheless, that didn't happen. That was my own issue. So all sorts of good experiments. There's debate, of course, about whether or not to use fear hierarchies. And of course, the modern trend in anxiety treatment as a whole, not just social anxiety, is not necessarily that they might go back and forth doing things that are very high on their hierarchy, if you have them do a hierarchy at all, to things that are low on their hierarchy. The thing is giving them lots of different experiences. I agree with that. However, one thing to keep in mind is avoidance is the biggest enemy. And so if they're willing to do an exposure that triggers, they anticipate 40% anxiety rather than 80% anxiety at this point, then that's a great place to start. So I have people do a fear hierarchy, but this is not rigidly taking it step by step. They just turn to it periodically to look for ideas, but they do jump all over the place. And a lot of times they end up choosing experiments that aren't on their hierarchy at all, that are just things that are part of their daily life or that they want to add to their daily life. This is an example of the fear hierarchy filled out. Based on the Reed Wilson stuff, he now has this app, which is supposed to come out in, iOS as well as Android. So until then, I didn't feel like I could use it, but until now, I just use this log. The idea is just track challenges. He's not doing any of the cognitive work explicitly, at least not using worksheets. He just has people use an app to challenge themselves. Just, I want to challenge myself so I can move from here to there. But in order to do that, I have to pass through anxiety. So I use the concept of challenges. I define a challenge in the small print at the top as something that makes you at least a little bit anxious. If it doesn't make you anxious, it's not a challenge. You don't get to give yourself a point. If it used to make you anxious but no longer does, good for you, but it no longer counts. You got to keep challenging yourself. And in my groups, I have people all track that and report on it. I used to give out little prizes and stuff, but people just look at me strangely when I do that. So I've stopped doing it, but in any event, I do give people a lot of verbal support for challenging themselves, and one of the short version self-messages, the positive motivators that people often use is that I want to challenge myself. You know, the version of I want it that Reed Wilson talks about. In carrying out experiments, early on, as I said, people would typically fill out a cognitive restructuring worksheet first, which would help them come up with goals for the experiment. So notice in the cognitive restructuring worksheet, they set behavioral goals at the bottom, which always includes mindful focus, but other action steps they want to take. And even later, when they stop doing cognitive restructuring first, and they do this much shorter experiment worksheet, like that, they're still setting goals. They identify it as what the experiment is, what they want to do to test their hot box. So it's important to set goals, and the main goals are limiting safety-seeking behaviors, but it also includes more proactive goals like starting a conversation and prolonging the conversation. Speaking expansively is the phrase that I use, which I define as saying at least 3 sentences no matter what. And we practice that. Even if you're asking a question is rarely more than a sentence to somehow give more information. And so set behavioral goals for themselves, and then after the experiment, of course, do cognitive restructuring using the post-experiment worksheet, or in this case, the experiment worksheet, to identify what you can learn. During the experiment, again, mindful focus with thought diffusion is key. If somebody is running into a great deal of difficulty, this doesn't usually happen, but it does sometimes happen, I encourage people to take a CR break, I call it, a cognitive restructuring break, which usually involves going to the bathroom or someplace where they have a little bit of privacy, taking out their constructive attitude if they filled out a cognitive restructuring worksheet, which nowadays people are putting on their phone, rereading that and their behavioral goals, maybe setting an easier goal if maybe they set one that just feels too scary at the time, and coming back out of the bathroom. So not using the bathroom as too long of a safety behavior, but coming out of the bathroom and starting to interact with people again. But even if they're later in therapy and not having done cognitive restructuring first, they might still go to the bathroom, look at their goals, which they would still have before an experiment, and use some sort of self-motivating statement like, this is making me anxious, that's great. This is a way that I get from here to there, and I so damn much want to be there and not here anymore. And sort of give themselves what I call a pep talk, the sort of Reed Wilson thing. But again, that is something that only happens if the person's really running into a great deal of difficulty, which is actually not usually the case in experiments. Any questions about doing experiments, exposures combined with cognitive restructuring and mindful focus and thought diffusion before I get into the 2 final approaches? Yeah.
What are the paradoxes experiments? When I've done these or something like that, whatever, a lot of times I've figured out what doesn't happen. So like when someone's walking that imaginary dog on the street, people expecting that everyone's going to tell them, say things, and no one said anything. Should that be framed as like we didn't actually successfully complete the social mishap, or is that just for learning about non-occurrence of weird?
So the question is, in doing paradoxical experiments, a lot of time the feared outcome doesn't happen. And should that be framed with the client afterwards as that in fact they overestimated the probability of something happening or some other kind of learning? So on this second sheet, I want to show you the anxiety formula, which is often used. It's just a conceptualization. I don't know that it's precisely accurate, but it's a good way to think about things, is that the intensity of anxiety is dependent or is equal to how likely we think a threat is times multiplied by how severe we think the threat is, plus physiological issues like did we have a lot of coffee, were we born with certain genes, things that we don't usually have a lot of control over. We're taking medication that lessens or maybe increases anxiety, divided by coping. Most importantly, threat likelihood times threat severity over coping. And in the old days of CBT, a lot of the efforts with anxiety disorders generally, including social anxiety, was to do cognitive restructuring around threat likelihood. That we don't have to worry so much about this humiliating thing because it doesn't usually happen. The problem with that is we don't know for sure. Just because I wasn't humiliated this time, it doesn't mean I won't be humiliated next time. But the other problem with it is that the feared outcome with social anxiety is actually often silent. And so although in these worksheets, we ask them to identify behaviorally what we expect to happen, like someone laughing at them or rolling their eyes or turning away and walking off in a huff or saying, "Why are you so red?" or something like that. Although those are behavioral occurrences, a lot of time a client, if those don't happen, will say, "But he was just being nice." He still might think, they're not necessarily convinced, but might think I was foolish. So even if the behavioral thing doesn't, feared outcome doesn't happen, a client may still think that it's happening underneath them. And that's where acceptance and commitment therapy, as well as Reed Wilson's work, which is kind of ACT-C, come in handy. Yes, there's uncertainty there. We can never know for sure, even in those relatively rare occasions where people give you positive feedback. Anyway, in those relatively rare occasions, we don't know for sure that the person wasn't just being nice. So part of the work is not just seeing, did this terrible thing happen? And by the way, sometimes it does happen. You know, when I've had people stand around in Dupont Circle asking a whole series of people, where is Dupont Circle? Sometimes people do chuckle. It's never horrible, but you know, you're right here. Sometimes people do make a response that indicates they have some sort of negative thought. So part of what they're learning, which is I think the key one, is that they can cope with it and that the severity isn't so bad. It's no big deal if someone chuckles at me. Or even if this person thinks that I'm a fool when they walk away, oh well, that doesn't impact my life. Avoiding things because of social anxiety impacts my life, but having some stranger chuckle at me for 20 seconds, that doesn't impact my life. So part of what we're learning is that we can cope much better than we think, and that when bad things happen, it's not as bad as we think. Okay, now I want to get into the use of assertiveness, what Christine Tedeschi calls assertive defense of the self. First of all, a lot of socially anxious people have social anxiety about asserting themselves. And so some of their exposures will be to assert themselves in a variety of situations, maybe asking their roommate to clean up the dishes that they've been leaving behind for the last year and a half, or maybe asserting themselves with a boss or asking for a raise or something like that. So those may be some of the straightforward experiments that they want to do. However, Christine Tedeschi talks about, since it is possible that our fears will come true, it's also important for clients to know how to handle it when they do. That if all we teach them, as I was saying earlier, is that it's unlikely for their fears to come true, they're still likely to feel a great deal of social anxiety, thinking, but what about the next time? I've often wondered that with the treatment of ordinary phobias. Like, you know, a colleague of mine says, if somebody is afraid of dogs, they know whether or not the dog bit. We don't know whether or not the person is thinking badly of us usually. Of course, even with dogs, we don't know whether or not the dog or a different dog will bite you the next time. They don't usually, so there's a likelihood issue, but it's also learning that we can cope with it and that it's better to deal with that than to limit our lives so severely because of our anxiety. And so her strategy, which is useful, I think it has severe limitations, but I think it's a definitely useful adjunct, is helping to train people to assert themselves in the event that a fear comes true. Now, I want to give you a remarkable example that happened 2 weeks ago yesterday on Pennsylvania Avenue. The context here is political. Don't worry, I'm not going to get into politics, but that's the context. It was a huge national march for life. There were, I think, 800 or so marches around the country or world, and here the national one had, by different estimates, 300,000 to 500,000 people packed on Pennsylvania Avenue between the White House and the U.S. Capitol. And what was especially interesting is that all the speakers were teens. Actually, a few of them were younger. They were all kids. And they were all someone who survived some sort of shooting incident, including several people from the most recent one in Parkland, Florida, as well as older ones, as well as people whose brothers or whatever were killed in gun violence, but wasn't a mass shooting. And people gave very moving speeches. These were kids, which added to the movingness. And some people were also really good speakers. I was very impressed. But this one girl, 17-year-old or maybe 18-year-old senior at Parkland whose friends died, gave a speech. And although she started out strong, I feel awful, and I'm always paying attention to other people's social anxiety, but I do. And by the way, her face is projected. I mean, Pennsylvania Avenue at that point is more than a mile long, and so it's projected on huge jumbotrons every block or so. And she started out strong, but was visibly getting quite anxious. And at one point, she steps back from the podium and throws up on jumbotron in front of 300,000 to 500,000 people. And then the cameras pull away, but that was after it happened, show the crowd and stuff like that, which is cheering her on. Obviously, everyone was supportive. And then less than 2 minutes later, she comes back to the, I was wondering what was going to happen, because I was really rooting for her to continue. I just didn't want this to be a avoidant experience. And one thing, by the way, I want to say is, I don't know that she has social anxiety disorder. That's not my point. My point is admiring how she handled it. She comes back to the podium and says, and this is a word-for-word quote because it's on YouTube and I've been telling all my clients, I just threw up on international TV and it feels great. And then she continued her talk in, frankly, a much stronger delivery, including leading this massive crowd and singing happy birthday to one of the victims who would have turned 18 that day. So it was just a very moving experience, but it was also a remarkable example of what Tedeschi would call assertive defense of yourself in the face of a fear coming true. More commonly, examples are if somebody points out that you're anxious, having an assertion such as, yeah, I do get a little bit nervous when I'm talking to new people, but I'm enjoying this conversation, or I warm up after a little while, give me a chance, or whatever. People choose their own assertion. This worksheet is just the first step. I want to acknowledge right away something some of you may already have cleverly figured out. This is scripting, and I just said that scripting is a no-no. It's a safety-seeking behavior. I would say this is a judicious use and limited use of scripting. You're initially writing out some things that you would want to say if your fear came true, as well as things you would do if your fear came true. So if somebody was really very insulting to you, like if their fear come true was something like, you're not in my league, why would you think I would want to talk to you? The assertion might be rather strongly worded, like, you're right, I only want to talk to people who treat you with respect, goodbye, and then the behavioral assertion would be to walk away. Whereas if somebody just said, like, oh, you're kind of red, or you look a little nervous, are things okay? the assertion would probably be a softer one, like, yeah, I do get a little nervous talking to new people, but I'm enjoying the conversation, and continue the conversation rather than walking away. So we practice not only what would you say, but what would you do. And the worksheet is just the first step. Then we practice it in role plays. And Randy and I are going to do a couple, but before we do, I want to point out that there's a big hole in this model, or better put, a big limitation in this model. And that's what I said earlier, our fears are often invisible. Namely, how do I assert myself with somebody who may be thinking badly of me but doesn't say so? Tedeschi's rationale is practice it in role plays, practice it in imagery, and that'll help you feel more confident about it, even if you don't have the opportunity in real life to use it. And I do that, but I've had multiple clients tell me, and those practice things are fun, especially when done in group. So again, I might have a client, this is something they're choosing, I'm not as mean as it sounds, but have a client go around in the circle and be rejected by everyone in the group. This is after a few months of them having all sorts of group building exercises, but in any event, be rejected by a whole series of people, and they would just practice using different types of assertion depending on the nature of the rejection. But on multiple occasions, I've had clients say, but this is actually easier for me. If somebody were so mean and insensitive to actually say something like that to me, screw them, I don't care what they think. Well, good for my clients to feel that way. But if someone were nice enough, which they think most people are, and I would agree, and they would only keep those negative thoughts to themselves, then I can't assert myself with them and I still feel awful about it. So this technique has its limitations. What I use to help deal with those limitations, but it doesn't totally overcome it, but it does help, is use what I call proactive soft assertions, in addition to reactive stronger assertions. A reactive assertion is when a fear does come true, someone says something mean or critical to you, or you throw up in front of people, or something like that. So that would be a reactive assertion. A proactive assertion is when you're afraid that something negative is happening, but you don't know it. And you assert yourself in a way anyways. And you need to be important as their therapist when you're practicing this, that it not be a form of reassurance seeking, which it would very unlikely be anyways if they're dealing with strangers. Social anxious people are not seeking reassurance from strangers typically, although could. But you need to make sure that it's a kind of standing up for yourself and not reassurance seeking. So Randy and I are going to demonstrate reactive assertions. So in this case, I'm the client in session. Randy is the therapist playing a critical stranger. And we're using this to practice assertion. And so we've been having a conversation, and out of the blue,
what's wrong, Larry? You look a little uneasy. What's the matter?
oh, I didn't know you noticed that. I get a little nervous talking to new people. It's just one of my quirks, but I'm enjoying our conversation.
Oh, but you're actually not that good a conversationalist.
Well,
To tell you the truth.
I have other skills that I'm probably better at, but being a conversationalist is just about two people connecting, and I'm enjoying this. I'm sorry that you don't seem to be, but maybe over time it'll warm up.
I don't know. I got to get to my next meeting, so.
Well, look, I understand that different people have different tastes, and I'm just not among your tastes. That's okay, I respect that, but I have other people who like me, and I think I can go talk to one of them now. See you. Okay, so that would be an example of proactive assertions. Excuse me, reactive assertions, because the fear came true. Now let's do proactive assertions. In this case, I'm still the client. Randy is the therapist playing a nice stranger that I'm having a conversation with, and then out of the blue I might say, oh, by the way, don't mind me, I turn red easily, it's just a quirk that I have.
Oh, well, I think that happens to a lot of people.
Yeah, especially in my family, we're all red people. But in any event, yeah, I'm enjoying our conversation. And then maybe later in the conversation, I'm beginning to wonder if she's enjoying this or not. And I might say proactively, she didn't say anything critical, I might proactively say, by the way, I sort of like being friendly with people, and I hope I'm not bothering you. I'm just sort of enjoying this being friendly thing. And, I hope I'm not bothering you.
Not at all. Actually, I've been enjoying our conversation too. I don't know why you think that.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So again, you can use assertions, at least in some cases, proactively. Yeah.
It sounds a lot like reassurance.
Right. It's also testing pathos, that the person isn't reacting negatively to us. But as I say, this has a limited use. But some people find it useful, and not all clients do. Yeah.
Yeah, just trying to elaborate on how to make sure to use that non-escape behavior. Could one just make, like as a therapist, could you just make sure that that's done as an experiment? That, okay, in this particular conversation, we're going to let you get feedback to find out, whether you're bothering someone with very little things in the conversation feedback. But the rest of the time, you're not allowed to actually say this, and my bother.
Right. So in real life, for example, when I'm doing a field trip with clients, this might be a single goal amidst a much longer experiment. So for example, their goal might be to initiate conversation with multiple strangers in a public place and try to have 10-minute conversations whenever possible or longer, and then at some point in that conversation bring up whatever their fear is. So another one, we didn't act it out, that's probably less reassurance seeking sounding, might be purposely say something stupid. Sometimes head held high assertions are combined with paradoxical experiments. So in the middle of the conversation, I might have gotten Randy's name wrong, and she'd correct me, and then I would say, oops, sorry, I sometimes get names wrong. I guess it happens to the best of us. That would be an example of an assertion. It's reactive to a paradoxical experiment. I don't think it's as reassurance seeking, but in any event, this is really just an adjunct therapy. It's certainly not the central therapy. Any other feedback?
I just want to make a brief comment that there's so much shame involved that if you can get the client to say something proactive like, don't mind me, I blush easily when I meet new people, which is hard to get a client to do. I don't want to do that, but it can be very freeing to disclose that I have this little problem and see that people don't think much of it.
Yeah, I'm just piggybacking on that. I have my own social anxiety, so I just take the fact that I'm giving a workshop, I say, yeah, you're going to see me getting out, and that's just going to be how you're going to see me when I'm up here talking, or, if I'm shaking someone's hand, I might say, I have 20 hands, or, I've got social anxiety, I own it, but I think that's different. That's just stating the fact and getting on with it, rather than having this feeling like, do they notice that I'm sweaty under my pins? And what does that look like? So I have just found it helpful to just own it, say it, and then get over it.
And indeed, like on radio talk shows, I've noticed that sometimes someone calling in will start out by saying, I'm kind of nervous now. And then they go on and talk. It's just it's kind of a paradoxical experiment, a proactive assertion. They just put it out there. Often the host, which is hardly reassuring, will say something like, well, don't be. Gee, now that's an intervention. But in any event, it's often useful, but not for everyone. And I just want to acknowledge, I used a proactive head held high assertion in the beginning of the session. I was rather nervous yesterday, having attended a few days of workshops, thinking, oh my God, this sort of messy integrated model that I'm presenting is going to be highly critiqued by people as not adhering to one of the key models correctly, and Actually, Randy suggested to me that's a great opportunity for a proactive assertion, which I did in the beginning, where I just acknowledged this is a messy model. It's not purist, and that's okay. Knowing that if some people don't like that, that's fine. And it really lessened my anxiety just thinking about doing that, much less finally doing it this morning. Finally, yes.
Do you ever use humor? It looks to me like it would be really hard for these folks to laugh at themselves. Like I find when I do something embarrassing, I just laugh it off, and that's the easiest way to get through it and move on. Do they seem like they might have a hard time?
Depending on it depends on the person's personality. So if a person enjoys using humor, some people, of course, use humor as a safety-seeking behavior. They're heavily using jokes and stuff in a conversation because they've learned that it gets a good response, but they're not letting a conversation flow naturally or someone get to know them. On the other hand, which is what you're getting at, using humor, in the classic comedian sense, a self-effacing joke, that's just me, it's just one of those little quirks. How about you, what are your quirks? Or something like that. Using humor in the midst of an assertion is often really useful, and they do practice that, but it depends on the person's personality. For some people, it would be very forced.
I just want to add one quick thing, 10 seconds, because I know we need to move on. But how many of you are familiar with Washington Week, which comes after PBS NewsHour every Friday evening? Robert Costa is the young, baby-faced host. Anyway, he's introducing his panel, or some expert that's going to comment, and mispronounces an Italian name on network TV, and he says, "And I'm Italian." That was a very good example of self-effacing humor. And I will say to my clients sometimes, watch some newscasters and watch how they handle a gaffe, a social gaffe.
The last strategy is working on underlying assumptions and core beliefs. In earlier models of social anxiety, this was not addressed at all. I think because people were perceiving this as a phobia like any other, where you're just dealing with the immediate symptoms and the hot thoughts in the moment. And there are some socially anxious people, but I got to tell you, they're a small minority, both according to research and in my experience, for whom their social anxiety is a specific phobia. They're fine in life generally, but they have this one thing. Often that one thing is public speaking, which could be very debilitating for them in their careers. But in all other regards, they don't have any more experiences of social anxiety than anyone else without the disorder. And for them, the core belief work may be less important, although chances are there's perfectionistic beliefs there too, but it may be less important. And the DSM, up till the last one, the fours, specified a subtype of social anxiety, I think called specific versus generalized, but they actually dropped that because there really are very few who just have a single trigger. With most people, it's generalized, not to everything, but to multiple areas of life, which at least from a cognitive standpoint means there's underlying beliefs that are creating social anxiety in a variety of settings. In my experience, those beliefs fall into two categories, although those two categories overlap in arguably one category. Perfectionism and inadequacy. A belief that we have to handle things perfectly or others won't accept us, it's usually or the belief that I'm fundamentally deficient in certain ways. Now those are broad themes. This worksheet is just a shortened version of Young, I forget his first name, who does schema therapy, his work, his much longer questionnaire of just some basic common self-defeating core beliefs. Some of these are really underlying assumptions, some of these are core beliefs. I do realize there's a difference, but I don't find it extremely useful to differentiate that for clients, so I put them together. It depends on the client. It's very common for socially anxious people to think of themselves as deficient in some crucial way or ways that make them unlikable or not worthy of respect. For some people, it's circumscribed, but still debilitating. It might be, I'm bad at meeting people. So this might be someone whose self-esteem and mood is generally good, but they think they just suck at meeting people, and that's going to show and create humiliation and negative reactions. For some people, it's much broader, which is, I'm bad at relating to people until I get to know them really, really well, in which case they're more likely to experience depression in addition to their social anxiety, and their lives be much more severely impaired. There's perfectionism there too, because socially anxious people tend to greatly exaggerate the importance of their imperfections. So even though their core belief about being bad at meeting people is too black and white, it may have some truth to it, that actually they're not very confident meeting people, and they do come across awkwardly oftentimes. But they imagine it to be much worse and more problematic, more unacceptable to others. I attended a workshop yesterday afternoon where a couple of grad students reported on their research in this regard, and it was a very limited study, but nonetheless it was interesting, about perfectionism among socially anxious people, and specifically its perfectionistic expectations of what other people want. It's not so much that socially anxious people are more perfectionistic about their own self-expectations. Some are, but at least in this person's study it wasn't heightened compared to the general population. But what was severely heightened was their view of what other people expected of them. That if I don't handle interactions really, really well, then they're going to find me unacceptable and a loser. And those perfectionistic beliefs lead to not only social anxiety, but to much more depression than among others who don't have those perfectionistic beliefs, and obviously much more social isolation, which in itself probably leads to more depression. And so following David Clark in Britain, his model, there's significant core belief work that I think is ideal to do in social anxiety work. I want to acknowledge that not all clients want to go there. And some clients, as they start getting better, individual clients say, this has been great, goodbye. And that's fine. I mean, I raise with them what things that we could do, but I'm not going to drag someone into that and just let them know they can come back. And by the way, they don't usually come back, and when they do, it's often just for a booster. You know, like I ran into this little problem, or I'm the best man at a wedding, I have to give this speech or whatever, and so they want, 1 or 2 sessions. And so it does work, it does last. But I find that it's useful, as does Clark and his outcome studies demonstrated, to do core belief work as well. And what follows here, and I'm not going to go through all of it because it's just a great deal, and you can't see it from where you're seated by and large, but you have those handouts, are a bunch of handouts and worksheets doing a variety of classic CBT work on core beliefs that I might use with any number of clients, including socially anxious clients. But I want to point out 2 or 3 of these that are especially important and do another role play related to one of them. First of all, a couple clients of mine, actually a number of my clients, have given permission to hand out, without their names of course, their worksheets, or other exercises they did in writing, to future group members and to workshop participants as a demonstration of how to use this. These are examples of core beliefs, unhealthy and healthy alternative core beliefs that a couple of clients have written. Again, I realize it's hard to read, but you can look at those later. And then there's a wonderful exercise, and then one of the most important cognitive behavioral therapy strategies in dealing with core beliefs, if I could find it, is doing experiments to test and defy, I call it, to test out your core beliefs. For the sake of introducing this to my clients, I describe there being experiments in a few different realms. One I call straightforward experiments, which is basically the scientific model where we make predictions based on their core belief and we design experiments to test that. We do that experiment in multiple times, ideally multiple locations, and we come back and analyze the evidence just like a scientist would. But then there's a couple other ways of thinking about experiments, although they end up doing pretty much the same thing. There's really different ways to conceptualize them. One I call rebel experiments, where I describe it as rebelling against your old core beliefs. So if your old core beliefs say, don't initiate with new people, the rebel experiment would be to say, screw you, I'm going to initiate with whoever I damn well please. This sounds a little bit like the Reed Wilson stuff, where I want this. Or it might be your old core beliefs tell you that you're fundamentally deficient, so the rebel experiments might be, I don't care, we're all deficient. We're just a collection of deficiencies and strengths. And the experiment might be to, in the course of, this would be a soft assertion, in the course, or paradoxical experiment as well, in the course of conversation, reveal your deficiencies, like make mistakes on purpose, just mention that you're a blusher or something like that. Another way to think, conceptualize experiments to test core beliefs, including underlying assumptions, is act as if, or Reed Wilson calls it act as though, but it's the same thing, which is basically, and the phrase comes, I think, from AA. They also call it fake it till you make it, which is probably not a good phrase because I don't want people to think of it as fake. It actually is very real. It's just they may be acting on something that they're only partly there but want to be there. So for example, if their new core belief is something like, I'm a collection of strengths and deficiencies like we all are, and the challenge is just enjoying the connection and seeing who connects well with me, or something to that effect. But they believe that maybe 51% on a given day, their experiment might be act as if you believed it 100%. What would that mean? And it might initially be an imagery experiment, thinking it through. And some of the work we do is in imaginal exposure, thinking things through. But then they would go out and do a real experiment. Okay, I'm going to go to this meetup and act as if I'm confident about myself. Regardless of how nervous I might actually be feeling, I'm going to behave as though I were completely confident. And for some people, they find that approach to be very helpful as well. Another strategy that Randy and I will illustrate is doing what I call a core belief argument. So in this role play, I'm the therapist, Randy is the client who's been working with me probably for a couple months now, making a good deal of progress doing experiments. Randy, we've been doing some core belief work, and you've identified some of the core beliefs that you're working on changing, and you've made a lot of progress doing your experiments and so forth. I'm really very impressed. I have this exercise, an experiment in here that I would like to try out with you. And it's similar to something we did before, but a level deeper. Remember how we had practiced arguing with your hot thoughts and dismissing them? I'm going to suggest that we do the same thing a level or two deeper with your underlying assumptions and core beliefs.
Okay.
So again, you are being yourself, acting as if you fully believe your healthy new core beliefs that you've outlined here. Whereas I'm going to be your unhealthy core beliefs, and what I'd like you to do is to dismiss me, to silence me, using whatever means that you would like.
Okay.
Randy, you got to get out of this therapy. It's making you do all sorts of risky stuff in which your deficiencies are going to show. I'm telling you, you're fundamentally deficient. You don't want people to see this.
I've been listening to you for years, and I'm not buying it anymore. I think you're the one who's deficient, giving me these thoughts.
What are you talking about? I am helping you. I've been guiding you since adolescence, protecting you. I don't care that you're deficient. I just know everyone else does, and I want to protect you.
You've been holding me back. I mean, your protection isn't working, and that's why I'm here. And I'm just not listening to you anymore.
Very good. Congratulations. So that would be an example that might go on in real life for several minutes, and then we would talk about it. We might video record it. I also want to go back to one thing. There's a type of exercise, a 2-chair exercise that we're going to do that's aimed at helping clients deal with their ambivalence about doing a particular experiment. This comes from trial-based cognitive therapy, and in the first page, one of the first pages of the handouts, there's a reference to the manual on that, which is fantastic. And if you ever have a chance to do their weekend trainings, I would highly recommend it. A lot of trial-based cognitive therapy is core belief work. It's time-consuming. I can't do it in my groups. I do other core belief work in groups, but I love doing it individually. But this experiment is not this role play that we're about to do, which they call consensual role play. They're not consensual in the sense that I have your consent. Obviously, I do. It's more consensual in the sense we're trying to bring a consensus between your feelings and your thoughts about doing an experiment. Okay, so we're going to set up some chairs. And Randy is the client. Have a seat. So Randy, we've outlined, and we have it here on paper, the reasons you would like to do this experiment of going to a Toastmasters group and speaking, giving your 6-minute speech and having prepared very little for it. Okay?
Okay.
That's the experiment you're considering doing. And you have listed out your reasons that you would like to do it from a rational or intellectual point of view, as well as your reasons you're not so sure you want to do this, or actually pretty sure you don't want to do it from a more emotional point of view. But your intellect and your feelings are actually all part of you. It's not a bully, although sometimes it treats you like a bully does. It's really an integral part of you, and we want to bring them together, bring them into consensus together. And so we're going to do a role play where you go back and forth between the chairs. In this chair, you are the sort of intellectual part of you that really thinks it's a wise thing to go out and do this experiment as homework. And then we'll go back and forth. I'll give you some guidance. In this chair, you are your emotional self expressing why you don't think you want to.
Okay.
Actually, we're going to start with your emotional self, so have a seat here. So go tell your rational self why you had better come up with some excuse for not doing this experiment.
Randy, if I were you, I would not do this. I mean, you know what's going to happen. You're probably going to stumble. You're going to lose your place. You're going to shake in front of people. It's going to be a bad experience. It's probably going to reinforce your negative beliefs that you just cannot do it.
Okay, so come back to this chair. And in a way that's caring, almost like you're talking to a very dear friend of yours, because in a way your feelings are a dear friend of yours. Express why you do want to do this experiment.
You're going to be okay, Randy. I mean, you've been going to the Toastmasters on a weekly basis. You've been standing up in these little roles and, doing the little things. And, you have this in you, and you just need to get some practice. So you'll be fine.
Go back here. And from a feeling point of view, express why you're just still scared about it.
You know, I'm not really sure about that. I mean, there's a big difference between, you know, being the timekeeper at Toastmasters and standing up and giving a 6-minute speech where all eyes are totally on me, and I'm just not sure about this. Randy, um, you know, you will never get over this if you don't do it. And frankly, I have seen you do these things in different settings, maybe not a Toastmaster, maybe not so formal, but you certainly are able to stand up in front of people in meeting situations. And you're really, you know, you're very good. So, you know, I think you're going to be fine doing this.
And let her know how you're going to feel if you do it.
You are going to feel so good if you actually accomplish this. I mean, just think about how you're going to feel afterwards. You're not going to have all these negative thoughts that you usually have.
Very good. Thank you. Now, again, in real life, this would be longer. There's some preparatory work on a pros and cons worksheet. We would talk at different points about what percent you believe this versus what percent you believe that. But notice, as opposed to the other role plays we did, this is not arguing or simply dismissing your thoughts. This is a different approach where you're working toward consensus. You're using compassion, self-compassion, to care for this scared side of you. I use this primarily to help people deal with their ambivalence and anticipatory anxiety about doing experiments. So to put all of this together, actually let me show at the very bottom, I use the Leibowitz Social Anxiety Scale because it's freely available and quite good. Notice, again, some people, certain third wave models may not like this, but half the questions are about anxiety. I do think it is a realistic goal to help people reduce their anxiety. I do agree with third wave models that that is the wrong thing to focus on when doing exposures, because that'll only make you more anxious and turn a lot of otherwise good strategies into safety-seeking behaviors. But as a long-term goal, of course we want them to reduce their anxiety. That's a big part of what defines social anxiety disorder. So I use the Leibowitz, because it's fairly long, I do it at the beginning, somewhere in the middle, and at the end. But on a weekly basis, if they have a mood problem, I'll give them the Beck Depression Inventory or something, some briefer version. But this comes from Heimberg's book, Social Anxiety Progress Record. It's just 4 questions, purely subjective, that are basically asking the client, how are you doing in these 4 areas of social anxiety? Basically, how you're feeling, how you're behaving, in other words, how much you're avoiding or not, what your thinking is, how concerned you are in your thoughts, and finally, the overall impairment or impact of social anxiety in your life. Because it's only 4 questions, I have them fill that out every time if that's something they're working on, if they're socially anxious, that is. And it gives me a quick glance of saying, oh, gee, it looks like you're making a lot of progress in this area. That's wonderful. So I could do a lot of affirming. Sometimes it's the other way around, though. Like, I've been sensing that you've been making an awful lot of progress, that you're avoiding a whole lot less, and you're not letting your hot thoughts affect you nearly as much as you used to. But I've noticed you don't seem to be giving yourself much credit for that. Could you tell me? And so it might become a tool for intervention itself. Anyone have any additional questions?
So if I'm a psychiatrist, and I've been seeing a patient for many years. So if I start out in the session for 5 minutes, right, they might not be anxious, like initiating conversation with me, right? So
Right. Although they might be, but yeah.
They might be, yeah. So could I bring someone else in the office and have them?
So that would be ideal. My office isn't set up to do that, but when David Clark demonstrates this model, he brings in a receptionist, because he's lucky enough to have one, brings in a receptionist and has them talk to that person. But that's also part of why doing that exercise of starting a conversation is done in the very first session, where chances are they are feeling some anxiety. And of course, one nice thing about group is that they could keep practicing that for a number of weeks before they start feeling comfortable with people. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. Anyone in the Annapolis, Maryland area? It's unfortunate. When people are looking for referrals, I refer them to ADAA, ABCT, and ACT's websites. All have ways you can search by zip code, but not always find someone. Any other? Yeah.
Can you use surveys? Sometimes I do surveys with clients and identify active from other people, especially when those are not seen immediately in surveys. Like blushing, having surveys, but with myself and client.
Yeah.
What my person is into will blush, what they think about blushing. I'm just wondering what your opinion is on using this.
I think it's wonderful. It's somewhere in one of these handouts. I can't find it now, but Christine Podesky, and at least some of her trainings, talks about that. My most memorable experience of that was with somebody with severe shy bladder syndrome. And before he was willing to do exposures in bathrooms, the word exposure is definitely not right. Before willing to do experiments in bathrooms that were more difficult for him, he created a survey question for me. I forget exactly, but it's like, what would you think if you saw someone standing at the urinal who wasn't able to pee right away? And he was too embarrassed to send it to friends of his, so I sent it to all of my male friends. It was anonymous, of course. He wrote the survey and got back a bunch of responses. My friends have since gotten any number of questions like this from my client. And you get a variety of responses, but basically I wouldn't notice. I think it would be really weird if somebody were standing there staring at how long it takes for you to pee, or I would feel empathy because I have trouble sometimes or whatever. So it was quite eye-opening, and it really just allowed him to be willing to do some of the experiments. One last, yeah.
Sometimes clients with a legitimate social skills deficit, I'm wondering how you work with that, or you
Very good, yes. One of the debates I skipped over by mistake is to what extent we should use social skills training, or specifically to what extent is there a social skills deficit, or what looks like social skills deficit really a heavy reliance on safety behavior. So does someone not know how to make eye contact? Is it a skill deficit? Chances are they make fine eye contact, unless they're on the spectrum, that they make fine eye contact at other times when they're not anxious. So in some cases it's, I conceptualize it as a safety behavior. A crutch is what I call these to clients, and we practice in role plays letting go of that. But for some clients it is learning skills, so we practice how to join a group conversation. It's a little strange for me. It's as though I'm an expert on this, which I am not. I'm very much an introvert, but nonetheless, I've learned a few things in life. How to join a group conversation with strangers mingling at a party or something, if you don't know anyone or if you know one person in the group. So some of that is skills training, but it's an adjunct. It's certainly not the main thing. Okay, one last question? Yeah.
Along the same lines, if you notice something that is off-putting,
So if I notice something that's off-putting, which is actually fairly common, I have a number of clients, for some reason it drives me bonkers, but a number of clients who keep correcting sentences in the middle of their sentence because they want it to come out perfectly. And of course, to the listener, it's like, get it out, just get it out. It's frustrating. And so I conceptualize it as, I think I noticed one of your crutches. People aren't usually offended by using the word crutch or safety behavior that you're relying on a little bit. It's normal to correct yourself occasionally, but when you correct yourself a lot, it's self-defeating. So let's try as an experiment over the next 5 minutes, don't correct anything and just see how that goes until we turn it into an experiment and I conceive it, conceptualize it as a crutch. I'll be around, so if you want to ask further questions, and my contact information is on the very first handout. don't hesitate to contact me, please. Thank you for coming.